October 1964. The Santa Monica Civic Auditorium, California. Standing in the darkness at the side of the stage, half hidden behind the curtain, are 5 skinny young Englishmen with long hair and bad posture, and they are watching something that is ruining their lives in real time. They are the Rolling Stones. They are 21, 22 years old, and they are the hottest new band on the face of the earth. So hot that the producers of this show have handed them the most prestigious slot in all of entertainment, the closer, the final act, the name at the top of the poster. And out there on that stage, under the white lights, in front of 3,000 screaming teenagers, the man they have been booked to follow is currently making that decision look like the worst mistake in the history of show business. He is dancing on one leg. He is sliding across the floor like the laws of physics filed for divorce. He is dropping to his knees, screaming from somewhere below his heart, being wrapped in a cape and led away like a broken king, and then throwing the cape off and coming back again and again and again, while the audience loses its collective mind. Mick Jagger is standing in the wings watching this with his mouth slightly open, and what he is feeling is not excitement. It is dread. Because in a few minutes he is going to have to walk out onto that same stage in front of that same audience and follow it. Keith Richards would spend the next 60 years telling anyone who asked that following James Brown that day was the single worst mistake of the Rolling Stones' entire career. Not a bad gig, not an awkward night. The worst mistake of a career that lasted longer than most governments. So the question is, how did it happen? How did the biggest new band in the world end up standing in the wings, watching a 31-year-old man from Georgia dismantle them without ever saying their name? Stay with me, because the answer starts with an insult, and James Brown did not take insults. He collected them, and he paid every single one back with interest on stage where everyone could watch. To understand what that day meant, you have to understand what 1964 looked like from where James Brown was standing, because from where he was standing, it looked like a robbery in progress. The British invasion had landed in America that winter. The Beatles on Ed Sullivan in February, and then a flood behind them. Young white English bands, most of them barely out of their teens, playing American music, black American music, the blues, the R&B, the rock and roll that men like Chuck Berry and Little Richard and Muddy Waters had invented in the years when their own country wouldn't let them through the front door of half its venues. The Rolling Stones had named themselves after a Muddy Waters song. They had learned their trade note by note off records made by black men who were still, in 1964, being underpaid, underbilled, and pushed to the side of the stage in their own house. And now these English kids were arriving in America to thunderous screams, top billing, and television cameras for playing the music back to the country that had invented it. Nobody said this out loud at the TAMI show. Nobody had to. Everybody could read a poster. And James Brown in 1964 was not a man you wanted reading that particular poster, because he had just spent 2 years proving every expert in the industry wrong in the most public way possible. 2 years earlier, his own record label had refused to fund a live album. Live albums don't sell, they told him. So he had paid for it himself. His own money, a fortune at the time, gambled on a single night at the Apollo Theater. That album, Live at the Apollo, did not just sell, it detonated. It sat on the national charts for 66 straight weeks and climbed all the way to number 2. an unheard-of feat for a live R&B record, and it did something no marketing department could have planned. It made all of America desperate to see the thing they could only hear. Because here was the catch. Nobody had ever captured James Brown on film, not properly. The most electrifying live performer in the country existed for most Americans only as a rumor with a record attached. The TAMI show, a huge new concert film shot with revolutionary cameras, packed with the biggest names in music, destined for movie theaters across the country, was going to be the first time. The first time America would ever see James Brown move, and the producers gave the closing slot to the Rolling Stones. Let's sit inside that decision for a moment, because it's the engine of this whole story. The lineup for this thing was staggering. Chuck Berry, the Beach Boys, Marvin Gaye, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, the Supremes, Leslie Gore, a room full of giants. And the running order said, the man who had been the hardest-working act in American music for a decade, the man whose live show was already legend, the man whose album had just spent more than a year on the charts, would go on second to last, and then hand the stage, the finale, and the top of the poster to a band that had existed for about 2 years and was on its very first American tour. To James Brown, a man who had built his entire life on the principle that respect is taken, not given, a man who had shined shoes outside theaters he would later headline, that running order wasn't a scheduling choice. It was the oldest sentence in the American songbook, dressed up in a new suit. You can build it, but you can't own it. The kids get the crown. You get the warm-up. Now, here is what makes James Brown James Brown. He did not throw a tantrum. He did not walk out. He did not go to the newspapers. He went to the director, a young man named Steve Binder, and he told him one thing, calmly, repeatedly, like a weather report. Nobody follows James Brown. He said it before rehearsal. He said it during rehearsal. He said it the way you'd warn someone about a cliff, not a complaint, a fact. The producers had made their decision about the running order, and that was fine, because James Brown had made a decision of his own. If they wouldn't give him the last word on the poster, he would take the last word that actually mattered, the one the audience would remember. He would answer the insult the only way he ever answered anything, on stage, in public, beyond argument. October 28th and 29th, 1964. Free tickets had been handed out to local high schools, so the Santa Monica Civic was packed wall to wall with thousands of teenagers, mostly white California kids, most of whom had never seen anything remotely like what was about to walk out of that wing. The house band was made up of the best session musicians in Los Angeles. The cameras, a new high-resolution system the promoters were betting the whole film on, were rolling. Jan and Dean introduced him, and then, for the first time in the history of moving pictures, America met James Brown. What happened over the next 18 minutes has been studied like game film ever since. He opened at a sprint and never slowed down. The footwork was so fast, the cameramen struggled to frame it. The slides, the spins, the one-legged glide across the boards, like the floor was made of ice, and he was the only man in America who'd been told. Behind him, the famous Flames, Bobby Bird, Bobby Bennett, Lloyd Stallworth, moved like a drill team, and the band hit like a fist. He tore through his songs, and then he arrived at the one they still teach. Please, please, please. He sang it on his feet. Then he sang it on his knees. He collapsed, genuinely, alarmingly. A man wrung out to the last drop, and one of the Flames draped a cape over his shoulders and began leading him off. a broken king being helped from his own throne room. The audience was screaming. And then, at the edge of the stage, he stopped. He shrugged. The cape hit the floor, and he came back. Back to the microphone, back to his knees, back into the fire, as if the song itself would not let him leave. And then it happened again, and again, each collapse more total, each resurrection more impossible. 3,000 teenagers now standing on their chairs, screaming for a man their radio stations barely played, watching something that was half concert, half church, and half heavyweight fight. And if that's too many halves, that was exactly the point. By the time he closed with Night Train, soaked through, chest heaving, the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium was not an audience anymore. It was a congregation. And understand, the Stones were not the only ones watching from the dark. The wings of that stage held one of the greatest collections of talent ever gathered in one building. Marvin Gaye was back there. The Supremes were back there. Chuck Berry, the man who had helped invent the entire language everyone in the building spoke, was back there. Legends, watching another legend, and even they were pressed toward the curtain like school kids, because the cape routine wasn't a gimmick, and every performer in that wing knew it. It was theater older than television. The preacher overcome by the Spirit, the fighter who won't stay down, the man carried off broken who refuses 3 separate times to stay broken. Every collapse asked the audience a question: is he done? And every return answered it: never. You cannot learn that in 2 years of being famous. You learn it in 15 years of church basements and Chitlin Circuit stages and nights where the crowd is 11 people, and you give them the whole show anyway, because that is the job. That afternoon, 3,000 California teenagers watched 15 years of unpaid dues get cashed in 18 minutes. And in the wings, 5 young Englishmen were watching their prestigious closing slot turn into a sentence. Think about what that walk must have felt like. The stage is still hot, the air is still ringing, the audience is hoarse, spent, emptied out, because the man before you made sure of it, deliberately, professionally, one collapse at a time. And now you, Mick Jagger, 21 years old, on your first American tour, have to walk out into the crater and perform the same kind of music, some of it learned off the records of men exactly like the one who just left the stage. The Stones played their set, and by every honest account, they played it well. They were a real band, and they would go on to prove it for 6 decades. But that day was never a fair fight, and nobody knew it better than they did. They had been handed the top of the poster, and the man below them on that poster had quietly taken everything else. Keith Richards never pretended otherwise. For the rest of his life, whenever the TAMI show came up, he said the same thing, in interview after interview, with the weary honesty of a man describing an old scar. Following James Brown was the worst mistake of their careers, not because the Stones played badly, because it didn't matter how they played. No matter how well they performed, they could not top him. Nobody on earth could have that day on that stage. Jagger has spent 60 years being needled about it and has mostly taken it with good humor, which tells you something too. Some defeats you argue with. This one, the Stones simply filed under education. Jagger stood in that wing and studied the footwork like a man taking notes in a burning library. And if you've ever watched him move across a stage in the decades since, you've seen the homework. He never stopped borrowing from what he saw that afternoon in Santa Monica. Ask him. He's never really denied it. And now the ending, which is the best part. Because history has a sense of humor, and it is patient. The closing slot, the thing the whole insult was about, the crown the producers handed to the young Englishman? Nobody remembers it. Ask anyone what they know about the TAMI show, and you will hear one thing. It's the film where James Brown destroyed the Rolling Stones. His 18 minutes became the most celebrated concert footage of its era. Musicians name-check it in songs. Performers study it like scripture, and in 2006, the United States Library of Congress selected the film for permanent preservation in the National Film Registry as a national treasure. The man they wouldn't let close the show is the entire reason the show is immortal. The running order lasted one afternoon. The performance has lasted 60 years, and counting. They got the top of the poster. He got forever. So what do we do with this story? The honest thing, as always. The pride that drove James Brown that day was not a noble pride. It was the same towering, wounded, monstrous ego that made him fine his own musicians for a scuffed shoe and replace his entire band overnight. He was not gracious about billing, ever, with anyone. But that's the uncomfortable engine of this whole channel. The flaw and the greatness were the same machine. A humbler man would have accepted the running order, played a fine set, and been forgotten by spring. James Brown took a 2-line insult on a production schedule and turned it into 18 minutes that outlived everyone who wrote it. And give the Stones their due. They took the beating, admitted it out loud for 60 years, and learned more from that one afternoon than most bands learn from a lifetime of victories. That's why they lasted. Losing to the best, and knowing it, is an education money can't buy. They warned the director. He told them over and over, nobody follows James Brown. They didn't listen. Now it's in the Library of Congress. Subscribe for more true stories from music's greatest legends, and tell me in the comments, what's the greatest live performance you've ever seen with your own eyes?